Stuart here from Public Law Hacks, where we bring you simple guides to public law issues. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel for more content. Today we have 4 things that you absolutely must know for revision of the public order provisions in public law courses. So, number 1, human rights obligations. Police owe human rights obligations to people participating in protests and assemblies. So these obligations are relevant in loads of different circumstances. As a general tip, revision on the Human Rights Act can be really useful and relevant to loads of different questions and issues in public law, so you should spend some time on it. In this context, the right to freedom of expression and the right to freedom of assembly and association are protected under the European Convention on Human Rights, which is implemented in UK law by the Human Rights Act of 1998. Section 6 of the Human Rights Act makes it unlawful for a public authority to act in a way which is incompatible with the Convention right. This means the police must protect these rights in their actions. However, freedom of expression and assembly are qualified rights, which means that the state, including the police, are allowed to interfere with freedom of expression in certain circumstances. Now, an interference is not the same as a violation of the right to freedom of expression and assembly. An interference can be justified in order, for example, to protect public health, while a violation cannot be justified. As general rules, for expression to be protected, it must not harm other people, and for assembly to be protected, it must be peaceful. To assess whether there's been a violation of the rights, the court must consider 4 things: interference, legality, legitimate aims, and proportionality. Looking first at interference, we have to establish whether there was an interference by the state with the right. So, for example, did the police stop a protest, or did the police arrest someone for expressing themselves? The second question is legality. Was the interference by the police prescribed by law? So is there a law that allows the police to do what they did? Now, the Public Order Act of 1986 will be the main source of law here, and you should have a copy of this with you for the exam. This includes a check on how clear the law is as well, so that can be an important factor, particularly in respect of unclear common law powers. The third thing that the court will look at is whether or not the interference pursued a legitimate aim. And these legitimate aims are set out in the second paragraphs of Articles 10 and 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights. So was the interference for one of the reasons set out there? For example, restricting a protest to maintain public safety. This condition is usually easily satisfied by states. Now, the final section is normally the most challenging aspect. The question is whether the interference was proportionate to the legitimate aim that it was trying to pursue. So the court will ask a number of different questions here. So was the measure capable of achieving the aim that it was trying to achieve? Were there less intrusive measures available to achieve the aim? And was a fair balance struck between the interests of the community and the interests of the individual? When you're assessing measures like this in an exam, particularly in a problem question, you should look out in particular for disproportionate penalties, where somebody may be imprisoned for a long period of time or given a hefty fine for something relatively minor. There are also some useful cases for revision on the screen now. Turning then to the second revision topic, which is assembly and procession conditions. Now, the primary focus of your revision of legislation should be on the Public Order Act of 1986, and most universities will allow you to bring a copy of this into an exam with you, but you should still familiarise yourself with the legislation beforehand. In particular, it's important to learn the distinctions between assemblies and processions, which are outlined under Section 12 and Section 14 of the Public Order Act. The main differences are as follows. Assemblies are stationary, while processions are mobile. The police have fewer powers to control assemblies than they do processions. There is no advance notice requirement in respect of assemblies, but there is in respect of processions under Section 11 of the Act. And only trespassery assemblies can be banned outright, while it is possible to have an outright ban of processions. Now, when you have problem questions on this topic, you should look out for the conditions imposed on processions and assemblies. So these could be, for example, changing routes or limiting the numbers of people who could attend. In particular, pay attention to the circumstances when police can impose these conditions. So, for example, with processions, a senior police officer must reasonably believe the procession will cause serious public disorder, serious damage to property, serious disruption to the community, or that the purpose of the procession is to intimidate people in order for them to be allowed to impose the conditions. If those conditions are not met in the context of the question, it may be unlawful for the police to restrict or limit the procession in a particular way. So, it should also be noted that it is a criminal offence to knowingly fail to comply with a condition imposed on a procession or an assembly. So watch out for people arrested at events for particular things. There are some useful cases for revision on screen now. The third measure that you should have some time with is breach of the peace. Now, this is a good catch-all power to be aware of in public protest cases. So the police are allowed to arrest people under common law for breach of the peace. And this can arise in protest situations where the natural consequence of a person's conduct would be to provoke others to violence. Take a look at the case of Hammond versus the DPP as a good example of this. Now, breach of the peace is not a criminal offence itself, but where the police believe a person is about to breach the peace, they have a power under common law to arrest them. Criminal charges can be brought against the person under other legal provisions later on. For example, Section 5 of the Public Order Act, which we'll look at in just a second. Now, because the police can act before the breach of the peace occurs, there are often questions over when they should intervene. It can also have the effect of stifling protest. If you take a look at the case of Laporte, where the court said the breach of the peace had to be imminent before the police could start arresting people, you can see a good example of this. There are other good revision cases on screen for breach of the peace now. The last thing we're going to look at is Section 5 of the Public Order Act. This is a widely used criminal offence in protests, and you can see why when you look at how broad it is. It applies to situations where a person uses threatening or abusive words or behaviour, or displays any writing which is threatening or abusive within the sight or hearing of a person likely to be caused harassment, alarm, or distress thereby. Now, you should note that likely to be caused to distress is a very low bar, meaning that people can and have been charged for very minor things under this offence. It's also noteworthy that the legislation previously also covered insulting behaviour or words, but this was removed because it made the legislation too broad. Be careful here, as in problem questions, you may need to look at how serious the actions of the person are, whether they were merely insulting and fall outside the scope of the legislation, or whether they're threatening and abusive and fall within the scope of the definitions of Section 5. The last set of revision cases are on screen now. So those were our 4 things that you absolutely must know for revision of the public order provisions in public law courses. Please like the video and subscribe, it really helps. And if you would like to ask a question or request a video on another topic, please leave a comment below.